Good morning. Oh, pardon me. Good morning from beautiful Brisbane, Australia. How are you this morning? And welcome, Conscious Warriors. It's great to have you with me this morning, and welcome to class. We've had the most amazing storms in Brisbane overnight, so it's still a bit humid, but at least it's cooled down. How's the weather where you are, and how cold is it in the Northern Hemisphere? I'd happily spend a winter in the cold, I think, and then remind myself that, maybe being so hot isn't so bad. But let's get on with today, and we want to talk about symptoms of repressed emotions. Now, one of the things that we need to do or be willing to do throughout our conscious walk is ask ever increasing questions that shed more light or more understanding, more wisdom, more knowledge, greater internal understanding of what's happening for us. Now, with emotions, we can have suppressed emotions. So we can have emotions that we're sitting on that we know are there. And to have an example of that, we only have to think of the last time that somebody upset us, or we're in a situation where we got upset and we carried around those emotions for a number of days. And we have all done this. And then, we can actually identify those emotions, we can identify the time frame, and we can sit down and go, right, this is how I've walked through this process. However, with repressed emotions, we're not aware that we're actually holding on to them, because specifically with complex PTSD, when we've walked through our childhood and we've had no language around what these emotions are. So we've got to be raw and real and realise that for many generations, there's been no emotional education in families. So like a number of us have expressed, that for generations our families didn't talk about emotions. We've had rules around emotions. So in my family, when I'd get emotional, even the non-verbal cues were, if you can just get it together and not talk about it, everyone will be fine. Okay, so your place of acceptance in the family is provided that you don't talk about emotions, or you don't express them, or if you do express them, then we're going to call you a drama queen. They used to nickname me Elizabeth Taylor as a teenager. Because I would get emotional and I did want answers and I did want to understand, but because the generations before me had had no emotional education, then it was easier to make out that I'm the one with the problem. And that's okay now. At the time it wasn't. It was incredibly frustrating, and I used to leave notes under my parents' pillows and but no one would ever come to me and say, let's sit down and talk about this, let's work it through, let's process it, because they just didn't want to learn or didn't want to know or didn't think that there could be another way. Whereas for me, when I had my children, it was like, no matter what happens, let's work out a different way. So for us, our repressed emotions, and science is now showing how in the book The Body Keeps the Score, we hold on to so much. And we hold on to it not just in our body, but throughout our whole entire nervous system and so much more, our brain. And our brain actually won't let us let go of what's in the body until we're ready, until the brain it's like having a massive computer in our head with all the apps, and then once everything lines up and we're strong enough to deal with what comes up, then it comes up. So I know for me, the abandonment wound was very, very physical, but until I'd reached a stage of knowing who I am, living a purpose-driven life and feeling comfortable, it was till this abandonment wound came up that I didn't even know that I had. And that's a whole other chat show for another day about that whole process. But I wanted to give you some information today about how we can examine externally symptoms so that we can then begin to process internally what's happening for me if I'm feeling these symptoms, or if these symptoms are appearing in my life, then there's something happening for me at an unconscious level, and I need to be willing to ask myself some ever-increasing self-reflective questions so that I can get to the root cause of what's happening. I can look at my emotions, I can look at my behavior, I can look at the patterns throughout my life and go, right, that's one area where I can identify that I want change. So for me, one of my key areas is in relationships, obviously too, because we come out of such brokenness that we enter into brokenness in our adulthood. So after I had 2 marriage breakdowns, and they both were, so the first one wasn't in a manner of faith, so there was no deep spiritual context in that relationship. There was for me, but no structure. And in the second marriage, there was a deep structure of faith, but let's just say I got a whole education in, even if somebody says externally they're a person of faith, that if it's not impacting them internally, then it's just not going to work either. So I continue to learn about relationships, and as my children have grown up, we sit down and we have hard conversations around emotions, and we make sure that we don't leave that space. So for me, when I was raising my kids, it was always, no matter what tough emotions they were feeling, I would sit there and we would work it through. So now that they're adults, if I'm having tough emotions, then they won't leave that space until we've sat down and nutted it out together. And with my youngest, Nicholas, he's 21 now, we did this whole process the other night. And it's always a process in relationship when it comes to emotions of being willing to learn about each other, see each other's perspective. And for the first time in my life, we actually had a conversation yesterday about it, how for the first time in my life, when we had a tough conversation last week, I actually spoke up to a man and said, well, no, that's not right. That's not what's happening for me. And this is what I see. And in my experience, this is what we do in this situation. And I'm not going to be told that it's not about, I'm not going to be told that I'm wrong. There needs to be context. I'm not going to have someone say to me that how I'm feeling is wrong, because I need to work through this process. So I want to encourage you that as we go through this list of symptoms of repressed emotions, that take just one, okay? Don't try and take the whole library of symptoms of repressed emotions and say, oh yes, that's me, that's me, that's me, and walk away and do nothing. Just choose one and start making observations in your day-to-day life when it comes up. What are the situations that's impacting you that causes this area of pain or distress? How do you want to handle that differently? What do you need to learn about how to handle that differently? And just ask yourself a series of questions, knowing that if you're willing to say, okay, there's unconscious stuff happening for me here, then I'm going to go, right, it's like being an investigator, okay? Except you're not investigating anyone else except what's happening for you at a heart level, all right? And being willing to go that there's stuff happening for me and I want to know what it is so that I can dig it out and I can go, right, this stops with me, okay? I don't want to hand it on. I don't want to keep having this happen in my life, even though the cause of it happened in my childhood. I don't want to keep being unwell. One area of my life in particular that was like this was migraines. Part of my downhill run, so to speak, into really bad ill health. At that time, I was having migraines that required 30 milligrams of morphine every third day, and they weren't even and that wasn't even touching the pain. So what I learned to do was identify when the pain started happening and address it then, instead of being unconscious of the pain that was happening or the stress that was happening that was leading into the pain, and then it became a full-blown migraine. And as I've reduced the amount of time that it takes to recognise when I'm in pain, I don't suffer from, it's a rare day that I would ever get a migraine these days, because I've built that conscious awareness internally of what's happening for me. And this is why complex PTSD is so challenging, because it's different for all of us. But we can put the same set of circumstances, the same steps, the same kind of ideas into place, because physically and our brain, we are wired similarly, okay? How it comes out is different, but we can always go back to the neurology and say, right, this is how the process is happening for all of us. How it will appear is different. So here's our list for today of symptoms of repressed emotions. So remember, these things, the root of them are happening at an unconscious level, and it's up to us as conscious warriors to begin to develop a conscious awareness of what's happening layer upon layer. You know, good little onions that we are, we've got to peel away the layers. Okay, so fatigue. If you're suffering from a lot of fatigue, begin to develop an awareness around when the fatigue gets increasingly worse, okay? What's happening externally, in order that I can begin to identify the layers of emotions internally as well, okay? Or events. What are the events that are happening externally that may feel out of my control, or I'm having inflexible thinking around, etc. Okay, so depression without an apparent cause. When we speak about issues or interests rather than personal matters and feelings, and I really realised this recently, that I've developed a habit of doing this, not with people, not with my 3 closest friends, but with other people around me. I talk about my work, but I don't talk about what's happening for me personally. And I thought I really need to develop a better relationship process for the people that are just in, you know, the next circles out from me as well. And it's something that we can learn and that we choose to learn. And there's no shame around it, because we just didn't know. We weren't taught. And it's like, oh, okay, I can see I need to do that next. All right, that's my one next step. And the good thing is, because we have the internet, we can access so much information about how we can go about that as well. Okay, rarely speaking about our feelings, all right? So if you rarely talk about your feelings, begin to examine why you don't, what's happening, what's the experiences around it that you've had in the past. So in the past, when I look back at my first marriage, I tried so hard to express what was happening for me internally, but the response was just a brick wall. So then I have to look and ask myself some really hard questions. Am I still doing that? Or have I developed a better habit, a better way of relating around that? Okay. If I'm really talking about my emotions, I can ask myself the questions of what's my one next step to be able to talk about them. So I spent years journaling, which really helped me get out of the habit of not talking about them. So even though I was in a marriage where I couldn't talk about them, every night I'd sit down and journal and write them out and examine what was happening for me internally, which was just a godsend, to be honest, to have spent all these years writing. These days we can Google an emotional wheel, which is just amazing, and we can have it on our phone and just sit there and go, oh yeah. Because the one thing about emotions is, if we have the language to wrap our mind around, it becomes easier to unlock what's happening inside of us, okay? Are we blowing up over minor incidents? Are we walking around with a knot in our stomach or tightness in our throat? Or are we feeling hollow inside and we can't pinpoint it? And sometimes that hollowness inside of us can feel very painful. And I've had that, I don't know, 20 years ago or so. That was when I started. Look, I don't know what this pain is and I need to get rid of it. I need to deal with it. Okay, so feeling angry, not at the time something happens, but a few days later, that's a definite symptom of repressed emotions, because we're trying to process it, trying to wrap our mind around it, trying to get language around it. And until we have the language to wrap our mind around it, we can't get into that internal journey. So we want to have language, increase our language around what's happening for us internally. When you focus on discussions on your children, money, issues, rather than talking about yourselves. So if you're in a relationship and you sit down and you're talking about everything else except how you feel, because let's face it, it requires a lot of courage to be vulnerable around how we feel, all right? Then look at, am I swallowing things? Am I swallowing emotions? Is there something there I need to identify? And is my one next step simply, look, I know there's stuff inside of me, but I don't have the language for it yet, but I'm working towards being able to explain to you or express to you what's happening for me. And it does take time, but it is doable. I encourage you. Difficulty talking about yourself. Believe it or not, that's really challenging for me at times. I love talking about my work. I'm absolutely passionate about it, but I am challenged to talk about myself. And that's my one next step, is to be able to talk about myself a bit more. Trouble, personal relationships with family, friends, and acquaintances. And you can identify this by, there's this real sense of, I can't quite put my finger on what's going on here, but I know there's something. All right, so begin to do an internal journey around that. If you have a lack of ambition or motivation, you're definitely going to be looking at symptoms of, it's a definite symptom of repressed emotions. Lethargic, so when we've got that who cares attitude. And I tell you what, when you go through divorce, sometimes you can have that attitude. I definitely had that after my first divorce. It was like, well, who cares? No one cares. Especially when everyone walks away. It's just like this external symbol that nobody cares, all right? But we can learn to work internally with that. Difficulty accepting yourself and others. And some of these are really, really hard to do an internal reflection on. But remember, in group, we do this, and we do it together, and we do it in a supportive environment that we haven't often experienced in real life. So it gives us a real platform, it gives us a foundation to start doing this internal journey. Laughing outwardly but crying on the inside and telling no one. All right, if you're experiencing that, then let's get into group and let's start unpacking it bit by bit. And the thing is, once you speak up, there are other people who are experiencing exactly the same thing. We're not alone on this journey, even though our childhood may have set us up to believe that we're alone. Okay, so we need to be willing as adults to take one next step into identifying it. Now today, if you want, let me just show you the sheet. So these are the sheets that I do up for you, and they're in the professional, it just went straight out of my head this morning. Okay, so I'll give you the link to where you can find all these sheets so that you're able to either download them or you're able to keep them on your phone to remind yourself, to give you a source of, this is the one next thing that I'm working on. Okay, so if you just look in the comments very shortly, it will appear there. Now there's a whole range of worksheets, information, the videos, etc., so that you can have them for you. All right, so the link's there now. So go and grab it, and this video will be up there so that you've always got a place you can come to and go, I need to go back to that video, I need to get that worksheet, and that's the one next thing I want to work on. And work on them with your professional, okay, your mental health care professional, because they have that interpersonal relationship with you. They can also offer insight as to what's your one next step, or ask you really insightful questions to help you so that this time next year your journey looks different yet again. Thanks for joining in, girls. G'day, Michelle. It's great to see you this morning. And I will see you again tomorrow morning. Bye for now.